In this video, we're going to be looking at ethics and ethical issues in psychological research and ways of dealing with them. So the AQA specification says this, that pupils must know about ethics, including the role of the British Psychological Society's Code of Ethics, or the BPS Code of Ethics. Ethical issues that psychologists might encounter in the design and conduct of their studies, and ways of dealing with these ethical issues. It's really common to get questions on ethics that are application questions. So either you'll be given a novel study and you might be asked to consider the ethics surrounding that or ways that you might deal with ethical considerations. Or the other one might be thinking about a study that is in the specification. So for example, looking at Ash's research, discuss ethics and ways that Ash did or could have dealt with these ethical issues. So it's very, very common to get lots of AO2. Breaking it down a bit further, here's a checklist. These are the things that you need to know and the things that you need to be able to do with your knowledge of ethics. What hasn't come up and absolutely could come up is having to write a debriefing statement or a consent form, which we have seen a little bit of in past exams. Okay, so what we're talking about here are sort of ethical issues, and this is one of the most important considerations that psychologists have to keep in mind when planning and conducting their research. On the one hand, researchers, psychologists have a need to plan and conduct real important research that's going to contribute to society, research that is worthwhile, research that is innovative, and so on. But on the other hand, there's also the needs of our participants. We also have to ensure that we're respecting their dignity, that we're keeping in mind their well-being, and that our needs as researchers to produce authentic, valid, and worthwhile data doesn't supersede our participants' rights to be respected and have their dignity maintained. So that's where there's perhaps a little bit of a conflict. What rights do the participants have against what needs do you have as the researcher? So, for example, in a study, we might not want to tell the participants the aim of the research. For example, if we're testing politeness or manners, and we tell participants that our study is testing politeness and manners, then they're unlikely to act authentically. And we're unlikely as researchers to get data that is real, that is meaningful, and that we use to draw conclusions from. So in that instance, how do we go about this? Can we lie to our participants to get the data from them that we're looking for? Do we tell them what the study is really about and actually just end up with junk data ourselves? You can see that there is a little bit of a conflict here. And this is why it's important for ethics committees to analyze or sort of look at and evaluate any research proposals to ensure that the needs of the researcher is weighed up against the rights of the participants. And that's really the role of ethics, and that's the role of the British Psychological Society here. So, the British Psychological Society, they have published a code of ethics. It's a document which kind of outlines 4 major principles that researchers and psychologists must work around when they're designing and conducting research. They outline what behaviour is and isn't acceptable when dealing with participants. And it's all based around 4 key principles: respect, competence, responsibility, and integrity. I'd really recommend reading the Code of Ethics, or at least just scanning through it and seeing what some of the rules and guidelines and principles are. But really, for our purposes, we're mostly interested in the ethical guidelines. The ethical guidelines, this is a quasi-legal document, so a somewhat legal document. Now, researchers, psychologists are not going to go to prison if they break these guidelines. They're not breaking the law, but they do have a professional duty to observe these guidelines when conducting research. They won't go to prison, but they will lose their job and they will lose their BPS accredited status if they don't follow these guidelines. So it's really important that we consider these guidelines when designing and conducting research. So we're going to be looking at these guidelines These are implemented by ethics committees. These are groups of BPS accredited and appointed professionals that will look at research proposals and will perform a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether particular research is ethically sound and should be approved. So we're going to look at the role of ethics committees later on in the video. But for now, I just want you keeping this in mind, that all psychologists in the UK must keep in mind these ethical guidelines and must adhere to them when conducting research. And in order to police that and to make sure that this is happening, we have ethics committees that will review any research proposals, will ask for amendments if they don't think it's ethically sound, and will approve it if they are happy with it, if they do think that participants' rights are being upheld. So for the rest of this video, we're going to be looking at some of the major ethical issues that psychologists might face and look at ways of dealing with them in accordance with these guidelines that have been set out by the professional psychology organisation in the UK, the British Psychological Society. So the first one is informed consent. At its most basic level, participants in research should know what they're getting themselves into before they get into it. They should know what the research is about. They should know what's going to be required of them. They should know what's going to happen with their data, and so on. And they should know this prior to taking part, so that they can choose to take part with full knowledge of all aspects of the study. We should make sure that they are consenting voluntarily, so that they're not being coerced into taking part, that there's no consequences for not doing so, and so on. So, participants should be giving informed consent before taking part in a study. Just a little side note here, it's not possible for participants under 16 to give informed consent. If participants are under 16, consent needs to be provided by a parent or a guardian. Under 16 cannot consent for themselves. What happens is that the participant, or in the case of a participant who's under 16, their parent or guardian will be given a consent letter, which we're going to look at in just a moment. They're given this letter at the beginning of the study. It outlines everything they need to know about their rights and expectations. It's given at the beginning, and then they are asked to sign it to show that they consent. Sometimes, as a researcher, it's not going to be possible to get informed consent prior to the start of a study. So, for example, if getting informed consent, if giving the aims of our study to our participants means that our data is going to be meaningless, our data is not going to be authentic, then there are other ways that we can go about this. We have other options. So we'll look at those other options a little bit later on in the video as well. Okay, so how do we deal with informed consent? Well, we give a consent form prior to the study, before the study begins. We need to give all of our participants, or their guardians if under 16, a document which covers all of the following. We need to tell them the true aim of the research. What is our intention? What are we hoping to investigate? What's the purpose? If we can't do that, if that would jeopardize the authenticity of the study, then we would give them a fake aim here. We would lie to them. For example, Ash didn't tell his participants he was studying conformity. That would have yielded inauthentic behavior from his participants. So instead he told them it was a line judgment task. He told them he was testing visual perception. In this letter, we need to tell participants what's going to happen, what's the task all about, how long is it going to take them, what will be required of them. We need to give them information about their rights. So their right to confidentiality and privacy, their right to withdraw, so they can leave the study at any time without needing to explain why, without any justification, without any consequence. They need to be given the opportunity to ask any questions, so we might provide them with our phone number or an email address so they can follow up and ask questions before they take part so that they are fully informed. We need to make it clear to them that their participation is voluntary. They're not being coerced. There are no consequences if they don't. And then, crucially at the end, we need a signature from them or their guardian if under 16, and it needs to be dated. So this is kind of a quasi-legal document. It looks like this. We will insert the purpose of our study. We will briefly explain what's going to be required of them, for how long. We give them our information so that they can ask further questions if they have any. Then we ask them to sign and date it. Or if it's somebody who's under 16, we ask their guardian to sign and date it on behalf of. This is only if under 16. Okay. So, we mentioned earlier that sometimes it's not going to be possible to gain informed consent without affecting the integrity of the study. So if we're telling people that we're going to be observing how hard they work in a lesson, they're going to work harder in that lesson. And then our data has been compromised. So if we can't gain informed consent, we can't tell participants the real aim prior to the study. What we can do is get prior general consent. This is where we ask the participants beforehand if, hypothetically, whether they would agree to participate in a study that contained deception. We don't tell them what the deception is. We just say that deception may happen. Would you agree to consent? We could ask presumptive consent. This is where we ask a group of similar people to our participants. So if we're studying upper sixth psychology students at Caterham School, then we might go to Reigate College and we might ask upper sixth psychology students there, hey, this is the study, this is what's going to be required, this is how you'd be deceived, would you agree to take part? And if those people at Reigate College say, yeah, that would be fine, I'd be happy to participate, then we presume, presumptive consent, we presume that the Caterham pupils would be happy to as well. The final thing that we can do is just not get consent from them before the study at all. We can retrospectively request their consent. So after the study has taken place, then when we tell them the true aims, we can ask for their consent for their data to be included. So at that point, if they're not happy, they can say, no, you can't use my data. I'm not being included in this study. And then we would scratch their data from our records and that would be the end of it. So there's some ways that we can get consent if we can't give them the aims of the study beforehand, if there's no way that we can get their informed consent without jeopardizing the integrity of the study. So that is the ethical guideline number 1, informed consent. Ethical guideline number 2 is regarding deception. Deception means deliberately misleading or withholding information from participants at any stage of the investigation. And it's linked to informed consent. Participants who haven't received adequate information when they agree to take part, or worse, maybe they would intentionally lied to, cannot be said to have given informed consent. Despite that, there are some occasions where deception can be justified if it doesn't cause undue distress to our participants. Sometimes it's necessary to deceive. So it should be avoided if possible, but sometimes it's going to be necessary if revealing to them too much information or revealing to them the true aim would jeopardize our results. For example, Ash told participants that it was a line judgment task. He deceived them. He lied to them about the true aims because otherwise he would have got inauthentic data. Now, at that point in time when Ash was conducting his research, there weren't ethics committees. There was nobody to hold him to account. It might be argued that nowadays participants were unduly distressed, and therefore the deception in telling them the incorrect aim isn't justified. But sometimes it's fine to deceive participants. Sometimes withholding information isn't going to cause them any distress. For example, if we give our participant a cup of coffee and then test their reaction time. It might not be necessary to tell them that there was a condition next door that didn't receive any caffeine. That's unlikely to affect their behavior. It's unlikely to make them upset or anxious. So it's kind of fine. But of course, this is what an ethics committee would decide when performing their cost-benefit analysis. The next ethical principle or guideline is protection of participants from harm. As a result of their involvement in our study, participants should not be placed at any more risk than they would be in their normal, everyday lives. We cannot subject them to any more physical or psychological harm than they would ordinarily experience. This could be embarrassment, this could be shame, this could be feelings of inadequacy, this could be being placed under undue stress or pressure. We should try and avoid that at all costs. We should also, in order to deal with this, something that we might do is debrief our participants afterwards. We're going to talk about debriefing in just a second. But that's an important way that we can deal with any harm that might have been caused. And this links into withdrawal of data or withdrawal rights as well. So if participants have been harmed or if there's potential for them to be harmed, then we need to make sure they can leave at any time so that we're not coercing them to stay and experience that harm. Okay, ethical principle number 4, and this also ties in with dealing with deception and protection from harm. So debriefing is really, really important. Debriefing happens at the end of the study. I've got it written there. It happens at the end of the study. So informed consent happens at the beginning, before the study takes place. Debriefing happens afterwards. What happens during the debrief? Right. So participants are told the true aims of the study, or they're reminded. If they were told the aims at the beginning, then they're reminded of the aims. If they were deceived, then we give them the true aims, what this study was really about and why it was necessary to deceive them. They are told about the conditions of the experiment. For example, if they were part of the experimental condition and they received caffeine, then they're going to be told that there was another condition that didn't receive caffeine. So any information we withheld to begin with is now told to them. They get everything. We remind them of their rights. So we remind them of their right to confidentiality and privacy. We remind them of their right to withdraw their data. So they've got to this point. Are they still happy for their data to be included in our final analysis? If not, we scratch it. But we have to remind them that even now, they can withdraw. They don't have to participate. An important part of the debrief is reassurance that the participants' behavior was normal. It was typical. There's nothing unusual about it. It's absolutely fine. And that ties into, in particular, protection from harm. If they were embarrassed, if they were ashamed of how they responded, or if they were made to feel like a failure, for example, we have to reassure them that everything they experienced was totally normal. Most people do the same. It's okay. We give them our email address so that if they have further questions in the future, then they can ask us. Also, if they choose in a week's time to withdraw their data, they know who to contact. Now, this one is an if. If a topic has been a little bit controversial, if it's been a very, very sensitive topic, then they might be provided with some sort of helpline support details. For example, if in the course of the research, we have found that one of our participants is actually addicted to drugs or has very severe depression. In that case, it's our duty as a researcher to ensure that they get the help they need. The help that they need. That might not be from us, but it's important that they know who to go to get that help. So this is what our debrief may look like. Of course, you insert the details for your particular experiment. So we thank them for taking part. We tell them the aims of the research, or we remind them of the aims. We tell them what happened in the study, so what they did, but also maybe what they missed out on, what the other condition looked like. If they were deceived, we tell them what the deception was and why it was necessary to deceive them. We remind them of their rights to withdraw and their right to confidentiality and what's going to happen with their data. And we give them our contact information. If they want to get in touch to withdraw their data, or because they've got questions, this is who you contact and how. The next ethical guideline, which we've kind of touched on already, is the right to withdraw. Our participants should be informed that they can leave the research at any time, right from the start, at any point throughout the task, later on, a week after they left our psychology lab. They should be able to withdraw at any time, and there should be no consequences. They don't need to explain why. There's no justification needed. They can do it at any time, including a later date. So how do we make sure that we adhere to this guideline? How do we deal with the right to withdraw? Before the study, we tell them, you can withdraw from this point at any time, even after the conclusion of the study. You can withdraw your data. Now, once the data is published, once we've actually published our research, it's a bit too late. So we need to give them some sort of timeline of when they've got to decide, but they can withdraw even after the study. Throughout the research, we should remind them. Afterwards, in the debrief, at the conclusion of the study, they need to be told, once again, you can withdraw your data at this point or in the future by getting in touch. Now, it's interesting because quite often, in order to recruit participants, you need to provide some sort of financial incentive. You give a tenner for taking part. When I was at university doing my undergraduate psychology degree, you had to participate in 5 studies per semester in order to get your pass. Does that mean that there's a right to withdraw? There seems to be a little bit of a conflict there. So sometimes an ethics committee will need to consider the financial reward and whether that conflicts with A, their right to withdraw, and B, their informed consent and voluntary participation. Part of this ties into the Data Protection Act. So the I've forgotten the acronym. The Data Protection Act. GDPR, that's what I'm thinking of. Which means that, we've got, as professionals in any organization, social media companies, everybody has a right to, or an obligation to protect your data. And you can request the data at any time. And so, as researchers, we have to also adhere to the Data Protection Act and make sure that we are storing data effectively, that it can't be leaked, that individual participants' results can't be linked to their name or their address, that kind of thing. So we have to make sure that they have a right to withdraw. Okay, finally, confidentiality and anonymity or privacy. We have to make sure that the data of our participants remains anonymous throughout and beyond the study. So when we're publishing our data, there should be absolutely no way that individual results can get back to an individual person. So how do we make sure that this happens? How do we deal with confidentiality? We never use names or addresses or even any personal information. We would never say Caterham School pupils when conducting research. Because if we start talking about 16-year-old psychology pupils at Caterham School, well then that pool of possible people who it could be gets smaller and smaller. And it may be possible to identify individual results and link them to specific people. And that's not okay. We never reveal the name or the address or any personal information that could link a particular participant to our research. When we're collecting our data, when we're putting it in a spreadsheet, we never put data next to a name. We always link a participant's data to a participant ID. somewhere that is stored centrally and safely locked away, where we can link the ID to the participant so that if they want to withdraw their data, we can go into that file and we can scrap that from our research. But for the rest of the time, we don't actually deal with participant names ever. We're just dealing with IDs, and we have no idea who that ID corresponds to. If we're doing a case study, so if we're doing a really in-depth study on just one person, we never refer to them by their full name. We use their initials, so we might, for example, refer to them as KF or HM. We might use a pseudonym, so for example, Jeannie, the wild child. Jeannie her name wasn't really Jeannie. The reason she was given that name because she emerged out of a bottle like a genie into the real world after she was discovered in her parents' basement. So that's a pseudonym. It's a fake name given to that participant so that we can't identify who she actually is. Or we might use numbers. It might be participant 5, for example. During the debrief, we tell participants how their data is going to be protected, how we're going to ensure confidentiality, how we're going to keep it safe. And if we're going to follow up with participants later on, so therefore we need to keep their data and keep their details, then we need to make sure that they're kept safe. We need to make sure that it's all confidential and that it's not easy to match up a participant with their data. We need to make sure that there's some sort of barrier and that information is kept in separate places and should only be put together in the need of them withdrawing their data or us needing to follow up with them later on. So, back to sort of the BPS's role here, the British Psychological Society's role. Now, whenever they're deciding whether research can go ahead or not, they need to perform a cost-benefit analysis. They need to weigh up the needs of the researcher to get authentic data against the needs of the individual participant to have their well-being and their dignity respected. So they're always going to follow this cost-benefit approach. They're going to weigh up the costs and the benefits of research proposals to decide whether that research should go ahead. Some of the benefits that they're going to consider are the benefits to society. Hey, this is groundbreaking. This is really innovative research. This research needs to happen because it could potentially save lots of lives or improve our well-being. Some potential costs might be the damaging effects on the individual participants, or it could be that this could lead to discrimination against a whole group of people, and perhaps the harms that might come to them is not worth the research going ahead. They are also going to consider the reputation of psychology as a whole. If they think that there might be harms to psychology because psychologists are allowing these studies to go ahead, then they'll veto it and they won't allow it to be approved. So that's going to be the role of the ethics committee. They're going to decide whether research should go ahead by considering the costs of to our participants or groups of people or the reputation of psychology as a whole against the needs of this research to go ahead because it has benefits that actually could be far-ranging. So that's the role of the BPS ethics committee, and they are our ethical guidelines.